Chapter 1. The glass slipper shatters. The champagne glass trembled in Seraphina's hands as 300 pairs of eyes turned away from her. The Moonstone Palace ballroom stretched endlessly before her, all marble columns and crystal chandeliers casting rainbow shadows across couples spinning in perfect harmony. Everyone belonged somewhere, everyone except the girl in the borrowed silver dress that hung too loose on her small frame. Her wolf had been silent for months now, leaving her feeling hollow and broken in a world where strength meant everything. "Look at the little broken Omega," whispered Lady Cassandra, her voice carrying across the marble like poison. "Still pretending she belongs here." The laughter that followed cut deeper than claws, and Seraphina's cheeks burned as she pressed herself against the cold wall. She shouldn't have come. The invitation had been a mistake, or maybe a cruel joke. But somewhere in her foolish heart, she'd hoped tonight would be different. She'd hoped someone might see past her weakness and ask her to dance. The music swirled around her like a mockery as couples glided past in silk and diamonds. Her stepfamily hadn't even acknowledged her presence. They were too busy fawning over the visiting alpha dignitaries. Seraphina's fingers traced the simple silver necklace at her throat, her mother's last gift before the sickness took her. It was all she had left of the woman who'd promised her that true mates saw beyond pack status and power. Another lie, like so many others. A familiar scent hit her nostrils, pine and leather mixed with cruelty. Her blood turned to ice as Marcus Blackthorne materialized from the crowd, his dark eyes glittering with the same malice that had haunted her dreams for weeks. Her ex-boyfriend smiled, but there was nothing warm in it. Only possession. Only the promise of pain she'd barely escaped the last time he'd cornered her. "Hello, little mouse," he purred, stepping closer. "Did you really think you could hide from me in a crowd?" The room seemed to tilt as Marcus reached for her wrist, his grip iron-strong despite her attempt to pull away. "Please," she whispered, but the music drowned out her voice. No one was looking. No one cared about one broken Omega's terror. Then, like lightning splitting the darkness, a deep voice cut through her panic. "I believe this dance is mine." A stranger's hand covered Marcus's, and suddenly she could breathe again. Golden eyes met hers, not with pity, but with something that made her broken wolf stir for the first time in months. Before we begin, drop a comment below with your country and what time it is right now where you're watching. Whether it's sunrise in Nairobi, midnight in New York, afternoon in Canada, or evening in the Philippines, I want to know. Don't just sit back, tell me where in the world you are. Now, let's dive into the story. 3 months earlier, Seraphina had believed in fairy tales. She'd believed Marcus when he'd whispered promises under the full moon, when he'd traced her cheek and called her his perfect little Omega. The silver woodpack had welcomed her then, seeing her as Marcus's chosen mate rather than the weak wolf she truly was. But perfection had demands, and Seraphina's wolf had grown quieter with each passing day, until even her own pack questioned her worth. The first time Marcus hit her, she'd convinced herself it was an accident. Alphas were passionate, after all, everyone knew that. The second time, he'd blamed her wolf's weakness for making him lose control. By the third time, Seraphina stopped making excuses and started planning her escape. She'd fled in the middle of the night with nothing but her mother's necklace and the clothes on her back, leaving behind everything she'd ever known. The human city had offered anonymity, but no sanctuary. Working double shifts at the all-night diner barely covered her tiny apartment's rent, and the constant fear of discovery made her wolf retreat even deeper. Humans couldn't sense what she was, but they could sense something different, something that made them nervous around her. The loneliness ate at her like acid, until some nights she wondered if it would be easier to just disappear completely. The invitation to the Moonstone Ball had arrived by mistake, a mix-up with the previous tenant of her apartment. Seraphina should have thrown it away. Instead, she'd stared at the elegant script for hours, remembering her mother's stories about grand balls where lonely hearts found their missing pieces. The silver dress had cost her grocery money for 2 weeks, but something desperate inside her had whispered that maybe, just maybe, she deserved one night of beauty. Now, standing in her cramped bathroom at 3 in the morning, she'd scrubbed off the makeup that couldn't hide her tears. The ball had been exactly what she'd expected, a room full of people who belonged to a world that would never accept her. But those golden eyes, they'd looked at her like she was something precious rather than something broken. Like she was worth protecting. The stranger's face lingered in her memory as she finally fell into restless sleep, wondering if she'd dreamed the whole encounter. Damon Ashworth had ruled the Northern Territories for 7 years, and in all that time, he'd never felt his wolf respond to anyone the way it had to the trembling Omega in silver. The moment he'd seen Marcus Blackthorn's hand on her wrist, every instinct had roared to life: protect, claim, destroy anyone who dared harm what was his. But she didn't know who he was, and something about her terror had made him want to keep it that way, at least for now. He'd introduced himself simply as Damon, spinning her around the ballroom floor while her stepfamily gaped in shock. The girl, Seraphina, he learned from whispered gossip, had fit against him like she'd been made for his arms. Her wolf might have been silent, but his had recognized her immediately. Mate. The word had thundered through his consciousness with each beat of her heart against his chest, but she'd been too fragile, too scared to handle that truth yet. The background check his security team had compiled made his hands curl into fists. Marcus Blackthorn, a mid-level alpha from a minor pack with a history of violence toward females. Seraphina's disappearance 3 months ago. Her mother's death 5 years earlier, leaving her with a stepfamily that saw her as a burden. Every detail painted a picture of a woman who'd been failed by everyone supposed to protect her. But not anymore. Not while she carried his mate mark, whether she knew it or not. 3 days of careful investigation had led him to the Starlight Diner on 5th Street, where Seraphina worked the night shift. Damon had never set foot in a place so ordinary, but something about watching her serve coffee to truckers and insomniacs felt more real than any royal function he'd attended. She moved with quiet grace despite her exhaustion, treating every customer with gentle kindness even when they didn't deserve it. His wolf paced restlessly, demanding he claim her immediately, but Damon forced himself to wait. When she finally noticed him sitting in the corner booth, her eyes went wide with the same mix of wonder and disbelief he'd seen at the ball. "You're real," she whispered, as if she'd convinced herself he'd been a dream. Damon's heart clenched at the vulnerability in her voice. She had no idea she was talking to the most powerful alpha in the Northern Hemisphere. She just saw a man who'd been kind to her when no one else had. And maybe, for now, that was enough. "I shouldn't be talking to you," Seraphina whispered, but she didn't move away from the diner booth where Damon sat nursing his 3rd cup of coffee. The late-night crowd had thinned to just a few regulars, and her manager was dozing behind the counter. Every rational part of her brain screamed that this was dangerous. Strange men didn't seek out waitresses unless they wanted something. But those golden eyes held no cruelty, only a warmth that made her broken wolf whimper with longing. "Why?" Damon's voice was soft as velvet, and when he smiled, something fluttered in her chest that had been dead for months. "Are you running from someone?" The question was casual, but she caught the steel underneath it, the tone of a man who'd made people disappear for lesser offenses. Not that she could know that. To her, he was just impossibly handsome and inexplicably interested in a nobody like her. She should lie, should protect herself, but something about him made the truth spill out like water from a broken dam. "My ex-boyfriend," she admitted, her fingers worrying the edge of her apron. He hurt me. And he said he'd find me if I ever tried to leave." The confession hung between them like a live wire, and she immediately regretted it. Men didn't want damaged goods. They wanted strong, confident women who could stand beside them, not broken omegas who jumped at shadows. But instead of judgment, she saw Damon's jaw tighten with barely contained rage. "What's his name?" The question came out rougher than he'd intended, and Damon watched Seraphina flinch slightly. He forced himself to breathe, to remember that she didn't know what he was capable of. To her, he was just a concerned stranger, not the Alpha King who could have Marcus Blackthorn eliminated with a single phone call. "I'm sorry," he said more gently. No one should hurt you. Ever." The fierce protectiveness in his voice made her wolf stir weakly, recognizing something her human mind couldn't quite grasp. When Seraphina's shift ended at 6 in the morning, Damon was still there. He walked her to the bus stop in comfortable silence, his presence making her feel safer than she had in months. As the sun painted the sky in shades of rose and gold, she found herself telling him about her mother, about the pack she'd lost, about the loneliness that ate at her soul. And when he promised to see her again, she believed him. For the first time in forever, Seraphina allowed herself to hope that maybe, just maybe, someone could love her despite all her broken pieces. Chapter 2. The Hunt Begins. Marcus Blackthorne crumpled the private investigator's report in his fist, his wolf snarling with possessive rage. So his little Omega thought she could hide in the human city, serving coffee and pretending to be normal. The photographs scattered across his desk showed Seraphina looking painfully vulnerable in her uniform, but it was the last image that made his blood boil, her talking to a tall, dark-haired stranger with golden eyes that seemed to look right through the camera lens. "Find out everything about this man," Marcus commanded his beta, jabbing at the photograph. "I want to know his name, his pack, his weaknesses. No one touches what belongs to me." The beta nodded nervously, recognizing the deadly calm in his alpha's voice. Marcus had been spiraling since Seraphina's escape, his reputation within the pack suffering as word spread that he couldn't even control one weak Omega. But he'd get her back. And this time, he'd make sure she never even thought about running again. Meanwhile, 300 miles away, Seraphina was discovering what it felt like to be cherished. Damon appeared at the diner every night, staying until her shift ended and walking her home like it was the most natural thing in the world. He brought her books when she mentioned loving to read, listened to her stories about her mother with genuine interest, and never once pushed for more than gentle conversation. She was falling for him with a desperation that terrified her. "Tell me about your family," she asked one night as they sat on her fire escape, watching the city lights twinkle below. The question made Damon's wolf pace restlessly. How could he explain that his family consisted of pack hierarchies and political alliances she couldn't imagine? That he was responsible for thousands of wolves across multiple territories? Instead, he told her about loneliness, about the weight of expectations, about wondering if anyone would ever see him as more than his position. The honesty in his voice made her chest ache with recognition. But in the shadows across the street, a figure with a camera captured every tender moment. Marcus's spy network was closing in, and soon the hunter would become the hunted. Seraphina's borrowed time in paradise was running out, and the golden-eyed stranger beside her carried secrets that would either save her or destroy them both. As Damon's hand found hers in the darkness, neither of them noticed the red eyes watching from the alley below, or the low growl that promised violence was coming. The flowers arrived at the diner on a Tuesday morning, 24 blood-red roses with a note that made Seraphina's hands shake. "You can't hide forever, little mouse. I'm coming for what's mine. M." The other waitresses cooed over the romantic gesture, but Seraphina saw the threat hidden in every crimson petal. Marcus had found her. Her sanctuary was crumbling, and the worst part was that she'd dragged Damon into her nightmare. She clutched the note so tightly that the paper cut into her palm, a thin line of blood appearing on the expensive cardstock. For just a moment, she could have sworn the red droplet shimmered strangely in the fluorescent diner lighting, but stress made people see things that weren't there. "We need to call the police," Damon said that night, his voice carefully controlled as he read the note. But inside, his wolf was howling for blood. Marcus Blackthorne had just signed his own death warrant. Something primal and possessive clawed at Damon's chest as he watched Seraphina's hands tremble. The scent of her fear made his canines extend involuntarily, and he had to force himself to breathe deeply to maintain control. "Has he contacted you before this?" Seraphina shook her head, tears threatening to spill over. She'd been so careful, so quiet. How had he tracked her down? The answer came with her manager's apologetic explanation. A man claiming to be her brother had called asking about her schedule. Marcus wasn't just hunting her anymore. He was studying her, learning her patterns like a predator stalking wounded prey. The weight of impending doom settled over Seraphina like a suffocating blanket. She'd been foolish to think she could outrun her past forever. Wolves like Marcus didn't give up. They pursued until they reclaimed what they considered theirs or destroyed it trying. That night, she barely slept, every shadow outside her window looking like his silhouette, every creak of the old building making her heart race. Damon had insisted on staying, but even his presence couldn't chase away the bone-deep certainty that her borrowed time was up. She found herself staring at her mother's necklace in the moonlight, wondering if she'd die wearing the only thing left of the woman who'd promised her that destiny had plans for special wolves. Another lie, it seemed. The attack came 2 nights later, just as Seraphina was beginning to hope that maybe Marcus had moved on to easier prey. She was walking home from the library, arms full of romance novels that offered escape from her gray reality, when she caught his scent on the wind, pine and leather mixed with rage and something darker. Something that spoke of violence held barely in check. Marcus stepped out of the shadows like a nightmare made flesh, his eyes already shifting to wolf amber in the lamplight. Even in human form, he radiated menace, his smile holding all the warmth of a blade against skin. "Did you miss me, sweetheart?" His voice held the promise of retribution, and Seraphina's broken wolf finally found her voice, not to fight, but to call for help in a frequency only other wolves could hear. The desperate howl echoed through the spiritual plane, carrying her terror and pleading across the city to any wolf who might listen. "Please," she whispered, backing against a brick wall as Marcus advanced with predatory grace. The books scattered from her hands, their cheerful covers a mockery of the horror unfolding. "I never meant to hurt you. I just needed space to." The backhand sent her sprawling, and she tasted copper as her cheek hit the concrete. Pain exploded across her face, but it was nothing compared to the agony of knowing this was how she would die, alone, afraid, and forgotten in an alley that smelled of garbage and broken dreams. "Space," Marcus laughed, the sound devoid of warmth or sanity. "You're my mate, my property, and I'm done playing games." His claws extended as he reached for her throat, but instead of the familiar paralysis of fear, Seraphina felt something new flooding her system, fury. Pure, incandescent rage that burned away everything except the crystal-clear thought. How dare he touch her when Damon's gentle hands had shown her what true strength looked like? The emotion was so foreign, so powerful, that for a moment Seraphina couldn't breathe. She'd never felt anger like this, clean and bright and absolutely fearless. Marcus's claws raked across her forearm as she tried to block his attack, tearing through fabric and flesh like it was paper. Blood welled from the wounds, but instead of crying out, Seraphina found herself watching in fascination as her blood dripped onto the dirty concrete. The droplets hit the ground and something impossible happened. They began to glow. Not red like normal blood, but silver like liquid moonlight, spreading across the pavement in patterns that seemed almost like ancient writing. The light pulsed in rhythm with her heartbeat, growing brighter with each passing second until the entire alley was bathed in ethereal radiance. Marcus stumbled backward, his face going white with terror. "No," he whispered, and for the first time since she'd known him, his voice held fear instead of cruelty. "It's not possible. The bloodline died out centuries ago. You're just a broken omega." But his words died as the light intensified, and Seraphina felt something awakening inside her that had been sleeping her entire life. Power. Pure, ancient power that sang through her veins like liquid starlight. Her wolf wasn't broken, it had been waiting. Waiting for the moment when mortal danger would finally break through the barriers that had kept her true nature hidden even from herself. The transformation wasn't painful like she'd always heard. Instead, it felt like taking her first real breath after a lifetime of suffocating. Energy coursed through her body, healing the cuts on her arm as if they'd never existed. Her senses expanded exponentially. She could hear heartbeats from blocks away, smell emotions on the wind, feel the pulse of every living thing in a 3-mile radius. But most shocking of all was the sudden clarity in her mind. as if fog had lifted to reveal a landscape she'd never seen before. Memories that weren't quite memories flickered through her consciousness, images of wolves running beneath a silver moon, of ceremonies performed in sacred groves, of a time when her kind had been more than mere shifters. They had been the children of the moon goddess herself. Luna Primaris, Marcus breathed, falling to his knees as instinct overrode his conscious mind. Every wolf alive carried the genetic memory of the first bloodline, the original children of the moon goddess who had ruled over all supernatural creatures for millennia before mysteriously vanishing from history. Legend said they had been blessed with powers beyond imagination, able to command not just wolves, but the very forces of nature itself. Most believed the stories were myths, fairy tales told to pups to help them sleep. But Marcus was staring at living proof that the legends were real, and he was too terrified to move. The roar that split the night made Marcus freeze mid-grovel, but it barely registered in Seraphina's consciousness. She was too busy trying to process what was happening to her. The world looked different now. She could see auras around living beings, could sense the strength and intentions of every creature nearby. From the darkness stepped a figure that radiated power so pure and deadly that even Marcus's wolf whimpered in recognition, but Seraphina's newly awakened senses told her something that made her gasp. Damon's aura wasn't just that of a powerful alpha, it was ancient, noble, and somehow familiar in a way that made her soul sing with recognition. As if their bloodlines had been calling to each other across centuries, waiting for this moment to reunite. Damon's eyes blazed liquid gold as he took in the scene before him, Marcus on his knees, the silver light still emanating from Seraphina's skin, and the unmistakable scent of ancient magic hanging heavy in the air. His wolf had known from the first moment he'd seen her that she was special, but this changed everything. When he spoke, his voice carried the authority of a king, but underneath it was something else, awe, reverence, and the bone-deep recognition of prophecy fulfilled. Get away from the Luna Primaris. The title fell from his lips like a prayer, and Seraphina felt a shock of electricity run through her at the sound. Somehow, hearing it from Damon's mouth made it real in a way that Marcus's terrified whisper hadn't. "You knew," she said, and it wasn't a question. The pieces were clicking into place with supernatural clarity. Damon's instant recognition of her, his protective instincts, the way his wolf had called to hers even when she thought her wolf was broken. "You knew what I was." But even as she said it, she could see in his aura that it wasn't quite true. He'd known she was special, had sensed the ancient power sleeping in her veins, but he hadn't known the full truth any more than she had. The Luna Primaris bloodline had been hidden so well, protected by magic so powerful, that even she hadn't known what she truly was until mortal danger had finally awakened her birthright. "I knew you were mine," Damon said simply, stepping closer while being careful not to make any sudden movements. The power radiating from Seraphina was intoxicating and dangerous. She was still learning to control abilities that could level city blocks if mishandled. "I knew my wolf recognized yours in a way that went beyond normal mate bonds. But this..." He gestured to the silver light that still pulsed around her like a living thing. "This explains everything. Why you felt broken when you were actually perfect. Why your wolf stayed silent until you were truly threatened. The moon goddess herself was protecting you until you were ready to claim your heritage." Marcus chose that moment to try to crawl away, his survival instincts finally overriding his shock. But the movement caught Seraphina's attention, and she turned those newly awakened senses on him with laser focus. She could see his aura now, muddy brown shot through with threads of violence and possessiveness that made her stomach turn. How had she ever thought this pathetic creature could be her mate? The power inside her pulsed with indignation, and Marcus suddenly found himself unable to move, held in place by invisible bonds that felt like moonbeams made solid. "You hurt me," she said, her voice carrying harmonics that made the windows in nearby buildings vibrate. "You made me believe I was weak, broken, worthless." Each word hit Marcus like a physical blow, and he whimpered as the full weight of her displeasure settled over him. "I didn't know," Marcus babbled, tears streaming down his face as the Luna Primaris's power pressed against his mind. Please, I didn't know what you were. If I had known, you would have tried to control me instead of break me, Seraphina finished, and the accuracy of the statement made him flinch. She could see it all now, the patterns in his aura that spoke of deep-seated need to dominate, to possess, to break anything that threatened his fragile ego. He would never have been capable of loving her for who she truly was, only for what she could give him. The realization should have hurt, but instead it filled her with a strange sense of freedom. She had never been the problem. She had never been broken. She had simply been sleeping, waiting for the right moment to awaken. Damon watched the interplay with fascination and growing concern. Seraphina's power was magnificent, but it was also completely untrained. She was operating on pure instinct, and while that instinct seemed to be protecting her from making any catastrophic mistakes, the situation was volatile. One wrong emotional surge could result in Marcus being turned inside out, and while Damon wouldn't mourn the loss, having the Luna Primaris commit murder on the night of her awakening would send ripples through the supernatural world that could start wars. Seraphina, he said gently, using the voice he reserved for spooked horses and traumatized packmates. You don't have to hurt him. You're safe now. You're powerful enough that he can never threaten you again. The words penetrated the fog of newfound power, and Seraphina blinked as if waking from a dream. The silver light around her dimmed slightly, though it didn't disappear completely. She looked down at Marcus, really looked at him, and felt nothing but pity. He was so small now, so insignificant. The man who had haunted her nightmares for months was just a petty bully who preyed on those he perceived as weaker. But she wasn't weak. She never had been. Leave, she said, and the command carried enough power to make Marcus's bones vibrate. Leave this city. Leave this territory. And if you ever come near me again, if you ever hurt another Omega the way you hurt me, I will find you. And next time, I won't be so merciful. Marcus scrambled to his feet and ran, not looking back even once. His survival instincts were finally working properly, screaming at him to put as much distance as possible between himself and the most powerful supernatural being he'd ever encountered. Seraphina watched him go with detached interest, then turned her attention back to Damon. The silver light was fading now, but she could still feel the power humming beneath her skin like electricity waiting to be unleashed. What happens now? She asked, and for the first time since her awakening, she sounded like the uncertain young woman she'd been an hour ago. Damon's expression was tender as he finally closed the distance between them, his hands gentle as they cupped her face. The silver light responded to his touch, warming and brightening as if recognizing a kindred spirit. Now, he said softly, we figure out how to help you control the most powerful magic our kind has seen in 5 centuries. Now we deal with the fact that every pack in the world will either want to worship you or destroy you when word of this gets out. And now, his voice dropped to a whisper as he pressed his forehead against hers. Now I get to love the most magnificent woman in existence and try to be worthy of a mate who could reshape the supernatural world with a thought. The air crackled with barely contained violence as 2 alphas faced off over what they'd thought was a broken Omega between them. But Seraphina was no longer just a prize to be won. She was about to discover exactly how much power ran through her veins, and how many enemies would emerge from the shadows once the supernatural world learned that the Luna Primaris bloodline had returned. The silver light pulsed one final time before fading completely, but the change in Seraphina was permanent. She had awakened to her true heritage, and nothing would ever be the same again. In the distance, the howls of wolves echoed through the night, some in celebration, others in warning. The news was already spreading through the supernatural grapevine. The children of the moon goddess had returned, and the balance of power was about to shift in ways no one could predict. Chapter 3: The Alpha's Truth. Your mate. Marcus's laugh was ugly as he sized up the stranger who'd interrupted his hunt. This little bitch doesn't even have a functioning wolf. She's mine by right of first claim. But even as he spoke, his instincts screamed warnings. The golden-eyed man radiated power that made Marcus's wolf want to bare its throat in submission. This wasn't just any alpha, this was an apex predator who could crush him without breaking a sweat. Damon stepped forward with predatory grace, and Marcus stumbled backward despite himself. "She belongs to no one but herself," Damon said, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "But if you need pack law, let me educate you. I am Damon Ashworth, Alpha King of the Northern Territories. And you just laid hands on my true mate." The words hit Marcus like physical blows. The Alpha King. He'd been stalking the mate of the most powerful wolf in North America. His death warrant was already signed. Seraphina's world tilted sideways as the truth crashed over her. Alpha King. The man who'd sat in her diner booth, who'd walked her home and listened to her stories, was royalty among their kind. She pressed herself against the wall, feeling more broken than ever. What could a king want with a wolf who couldn't even shift properly? "You lied to me," she whispered, and the pain in her voice made Damon's heart shatter. "You've been lying this whole time." Seraphina. Damon turned toward her, his carefully controlled facade cracking. But that moment of distraction was all Marcus needed. With a snarl of desperate fury, he lunged forward, claws extended towards Seraphina's throat. If he couldn't have her, no one could. The attack was pure spite, the last act of a man who knew he was already dead. But he'd underestimated both the speed of a true alpha and the fierce protectiveness of a mate bond. Damon moved like lightning, intercepting Marcus mid-leap with bone-crushing force. They hit the pavement in a tangle of claws and fury, but the fight was over before it truly began. When the violence ended, Marcus lay unconscious and bleeding, while Damon knelt beside Seraphina with gentle hands that shook with the aftermath of rage. "I'm sorry," he whispered, not caring that his secret was blown. "I'm so sorry I couldn't tell you the truth. But please, please don't be afraid of me." In the distance, sirens wailed as someone called for help, but all Seraphina could focus on were those golden eyes filled with desperate love and the terrible fear that she would reject him for what he was. The hospital room smelled of antiseptic and fear as Seraphina sat on the edge of the bed, a bandage covering the cut on her cheek. The doctors had pronounced her physically fine, but inside, she felt like she was falling apart. Everything she thought she knew about Damon, about herself, about the impossibility of their connection, had been built on lies. An Alpha King didn't fall for broken omegas. Powerful wolves didn't waste time with waitresses who couldn't even shift. The revelation of her Luna Primaris heritage should have made her feel powerful, but instead it only deepened her confusion. Had he known what she was all along? Had their entire relationship been built on political calculation rather than genuine feeling? The silver light that had awakened in her veins now felt like a burden rather than a gift, marking her as something to be used rather than loved. "The attending physician says you can go home tonight," Damon said from the doorway, his voice carefully neutral. He changed from his blood-stained clothes into a crisp black suit that reminded her exactly how different their worlds were. Even the way he stood screamed authority and breeding, making her wonder how she'd ever missed the signs. The man who'd sat in her diner booth, who'd walked her home and listened to her stories, seemed like a stranger now. "I've arranged for security. Marcus won't bother you again." The clinical tone made her chest ache. This was the real him. Distant, powerful, untouchable. The Alpha King who ruled territories and commanded armies, not the gentle man who'd brought her books and held her hand under the stars. "Security," she repeated, the word tasting bitter on her tongue. "Of course. You probably have people for everything." She couldn't meet his eyes, couldn't bear to see pity or worse, regret that he'd gotten involved with someone so far beneath him. Even knowing she was Luna Primaris didn't erase the months of feeling worthless, of believing herself broken. "How long were you planning to keep playing normal? Until you got bored?" The accusation hung between them like a blade, and she saw him flinch as if she'd struck him. But the pain in his expression only made her angrier. He didn't get to hurt when he was the one who'd been lying from the beginning. "It was never playing," Damon said, stepping closer despite her obvious desire for distance. The hospital room suddenly felt too small, too intimate for the weight of everything unsaid between them. "Everything I told you about loneliness, about wanting someone to see me for who I am, that was real. You made me feel human again, Seraphina. You made me remember what it was like to be just a man instead of a crown." His voice cracked on the last word, and she finally looked up to see raw pain in those golden eyes. The same eyes that had made her feel safe, that had looked at her like she was precious rather than damaged. I didn't tell you because I was afraid you'd look at me exactly the way you're looking at me now. But before Seraphina could respond, before she could voice any of the 1,000 questions burning in her throat, the hospital room door opened with deliberate authority. The woman who entered moved like royalty, her silver hair swept into an elegant chignon, her designer clothes speaking of wealth and power that made even Damon's expensive suit look modest. She was beautiful in the way that spoke of good breeding and centuries of careful bloodline cultivation, but her eyes held a calculating coldness that made Seraphina's newly awakened instincts scream warnings. The woman's gaze swept over Seraphina with clinical assessment before settling on Damon with something that might have been maternal affection mixed with steel. "Mother," Damon said, and his voice held surprise mixed with wariness. "What are you doing here?" The woman, Queen Lysandra Ashworth, Seraphina realized with growing dread, smiled with the kind of warmth that never quite reached her eyes. She moved into the room like she owned it, which, given her status, she probably did. Every hospital in the territory would roll out red carpets for the former queen of the Northern Territories. "I came as soon as I heard about the incident," Lysandra said, her voice cultured and smooth as silk. "And about the remarkable discovery of our dear Seraphina's true heritage." The way she said it made Seraphina's skin crawl, like she was discussing a particularly interesting specimen rather than a person. "You heard remarkably quickly," Damon observed, and there was something sharp in his tone that made Seraphina look between them with growing unease. "News travels fast in our world, especially news this significant," Lysandra replied, but her attention had already shifted to Seraphina. "My dear child, you must be overwhelmed. Discovering you're the last of the Luna Primaris bloodline on the same night you nearly died, it's almost too much to believe." The older woman moved closer, her presence somehow filling the room despite her average height. "But then again, I always knew this day would come. The prophecies were quite clear about when and how you would awaken." The words hit Seraphina like ice water. "What prophecies?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. But even as she spoke, she could see the truth dawning in Damon's expression. Shock, horror, and something that looked like betrayal. "Mother," he said, his voice deadly quiet. "What have you done?" Lysandra's smile never wavered, but something predatory flickered in her eyes. "What I had to do to save our species, darling. What I've been planning for over 20 years. She turned back to Seraphina, her expression almost gentle. "Did you really think it was coincidence that you received an invitation to the Moonstone Ball? That it was delivered to your specific apartment by mistake?" The revelation hit Seraphina like a physical blow. The invitation that had seemed like a fairy tale miracle, the one bright spot in her gray existence, it had been orchestrated. Planned. She thought of how carefully she'd saved money for the silver dress, how hopeful she'd been that one magical night might change everything. "You sent it," she breathed, and Lysandra nodded with satisfaction. "Of course I did. Just as I arranged for Marcus Blackthorne to be at that same gathering 3 years ago where you first met. A violent, unstable alpha with just enough charisma to attract a lonely young Omega who'd lost her mother and was desperate for belonging. You hired him to hurt me?" The words came out as a roar, Seraphina's newfound power making the windows rattle in their frames. Silver light began to pulse beneath her skin as rage flooded her system. Everything, every moment of pain, every night she'd cried herself to sleep, every time Marcus had made her feel worthless. It had all been orchestrated by this woman. "Not hired," Lysandra corrected calmly, seemingly unaffected by the display of power. "Influenced. Marcus's violent tendencies were already there. I simply guided him toward you and encouraged those darker impulses." The prophecy was specific. Only a broken Omega reborn through love could awaken the Luna Primaris bloodline and unite the supernatural world against the coming darkness. Damon looked like he might be sick. "You're telling me you arranged for an innocent woman to be abused for years just to fulfill some ancient prophecy?" His voice shook with barely contained fury, and Seraphina could see his wolf struggling for control. The man she'd fallen in love with was horrified by what his mother had done, but that somehow made it worse. If even he was shocked, how deep did this manipulation go? How else was she supposed to be broken enough to accept the first kindness she encountered? Lysandra asked matter-of-factly. Seraphina needed to be desperate, isolated, and grateful for any scrap of genuine affection. Otherwise, she never would have trusted Damon enough for the mate bond to form properly. The mate bond, Seraphina whispered, her voice hollow. Even that, the one thing she'd believed was real and pure, and theirs had been orchestrated. Is any of it real? She looked at Damon, searching his face for answers she was terrified to find. But before he could respond, Lysandra continued her devastating revelations. Oh, the mate bond is entirely real, child. I couldn't manufacture that. It's a gift from the moon goddess herself. But I could arrange circumstances to ensure you met. Did you think it was coincidence that Damon happened to patrol the routes near your diner? That he always seemed to show up exactly when you needed him most? The hits kept coming, each revelation stripping away another layer of what Seraphina had believed about her life. You controlled his patrol routes, she said numbly. You made sure he would find me. Lysandra nodded with the satisfaction of a chess master revealing a winning strategy. I've been guiding events for 20 years, ever since the Oracle's prophecy became clear. The supernatural world stands on the brink of a war that could destroy us all. Ancient enemies are stirring, old grudges are awakening, and only the Luna Primaris can unite the fractured packs and species under one banner. But she had to be awakened properly, through genuine trauma and genuine love, not political calculation. So you destroyed my life to save the world, Seraphina said, her voice dangerously calm. The silver light under her skin pulsed brighter, responding to emotions she couldn't even name. Rage, betrayal, violation, all mixed with a bone-deep exhaustion that came from learning that nothing, absolutely nothing in her life had been her own choice. Did it ever occur to you to simply tell me the truth? To ask for my help instead of manipulating me like a puppet? But even as she asked, she knew the answer. Someone like Lysandra saw people as pieces on a board, not individuals with agency and feelings. A pampered princess who'd never known suffering wouldn't have the strength to face what's coming, Lysandra replied without a trace of remorse. You needed to be forged in fire, my dear. Broken down and rebuilt stronger. The prophecy was clear, only through the darkness could you find your light. She gestured to the silver glow emanating from Seraphina's skin. And look how magnificently it worked. You're more powerful now than any Luna Primaris in recorded history. Strong enough to face the shadow armies when they rise, strong enough to unite species that have been enemies for millennia. Damon finally found his voice, and when he spoke, it was with the cold authority of a king passing judgment. You're telling me that every moment of happiness I've had in the past month was built on a foundation of torture and manipulation? That the woman I love was chosen for me like a breeding mare? The pain in his voice made Seraphina's chest ache, but she couldn't comfort him. Not when she was drowning in her own betrayal. That every time I held her, every time I thought I was protecting her, I was actually just playing out your script. Your feelings are genuine, darling, Lysandra said, her tone almost gentle now. I couldn't manufacture love that bloomed naturally between you. I simply provided the circumstances for it to grow. The prophecy required a true mate bond, formed through choice rather than arrangement. Every emotion, every moment of connection, every sacrifice you would have made for each other, that's all completely real. I just ensured you would meet. But her reassurances felt like salt in open wounds. How could anything be real when the foundation was lies? The silence stretched between them, heavy with the weight of shattered illusions. Seraphina felt like she was drowning, pulled under by waves of betrayal and manipulation that stretched back years. Every choice she'd thought was hers, every moment of agency she'd believed she'd claimed, all of it had been guided by invisible strings pulled by a woman who saw her as a weapon to be forged rather than a person to be cherished. Get out, she said finally, her voice barely audible but carrying enough power to make the hospital equipment flicker. Both of you. Just get out. Seraphina, Damon started, but she cut him off with a look that could have frozen fire. How do I know any of this is real? She asked, gesturing between them. How do I know that you're not still following some script she wrote? That this isn't just another manipulation designed to keep me compliant? The question hung in the air like a death sentence, and she saw the exact moment it broke something inside him. But she couldn't care about his pain right now. She was too busy trying to figure out if she had any identity left that wasn't built on lies. Lysandra, however, seemed unmoved by the emotional devastation she'd wrought. "The coming war will not wait for your hurt feelings, child," she said calmly. "The shadow armies grow stronger with each passing day. Ancient evils that were sealed away millennia ago are breaking free. You can hate me all you like, but you cannot escape your destiny. You are the Luna Primaris, and our survival depends on you accepting that responsibility." She moved toward the door, her posture regal and unbending. "When you're ready to hear the full prophecy, when you're ready to understand what's truly at stake, you know where to find me." The former queen paused at the threshold, looking back with something that might have been genuine regret. "For what it's worth, I am sorry for the pain this caused you. But I would do it again in a heartbeat if it meant saving our people. Sometimes love requires sacrifice, even when that sacrifice is trust." And then she was gone, leaving behind only the lingering scent of expensive perfume and the smoking ruins of everything Seraphina had believed about her life. The silence stretched between them, filled with all the words they couldn't say. Seraphina felt hollowed out, like everything that had made her who she was had been scooped away, leaving only an empty shell behind. Finally, she stood, her legs unsteady. "I need time," she whispered. "I need to think." She saw the exact moment his heart broke, the way his shoulders sagged as if she'd physically wounded him. But she couldn't stay. Not when everything felt like another beautiful lie, no matter how genuine his feelings might be. As she walked past him toward the door, his voice stopped her cold. "I love you. Not your pack status, or your wolf, or what you can give me politically. Just you, exactly as you are. That's the only truth that matters." The words followed her into the hallway, where she finally allowed herself to cry for what felt like the millionth time since this nightmare began. But these tears were different, not just for what she'd lost, but for what she'd never really had in the first place. Her entire life had been a carefully orchestrated performance, and she didn't know where the manipulation ended and her real self began. The silver light under her skin pulsed weakly, responding to her emotional turmoil, and she wondered if even her awakened power was just another tool in Lysandra's grand design. As she walked through the sterile hospital corridors, past the concerned nurses and the security detail Damon had arranged, one thought echoed through her mind with devastating clarity: if your whole life is a lie, how do you ever learn to trust the truth? The prophecy Lysandra had mentioned hung over her like a storm cloud, promising revelations that would either save the supernatural world or destroy what little sanity she had left. But for now, all she wanted was to disappear into the darkness and try to figure out who Seraphina really was when no one was pulling her strings. Chapter 4. The Choice. 3 days later, Seraphina was packing her few belongings when the knock came. The small suitcase lay open on her bed, containing everything she owned in the world: a handful of clothes, her mother's necklace, and the books Damon had given her that now felt like beautiful lies. She'd expected the knock to be Damon. He'd sent flowers, letters, even her favorite coffee from the diner, all of which remained untouched by her door. But when she opened it, her stepmother Vivian stood there with a smile that didn't reach her eyes, looking like a predator who'd finally cornered her prey. "Hello, dear," the older woman purred. "We need to talk." Behind her lurked Seraphina's stepbrother Cain, his expression promising violence if she tried to refuse. The sight of them made something deep in Seraphina's chest clench with a fear that felt older than this lifetime. "The Blackthorn Pack is very upset about Marcus's condition," Vivian continued as she pushed her way into the tiny apartment, her designer heels clicking against the worn linoleum. Cain followed, his bulk making the small space feel suffocating. "Assault charges against their future alpha? That simply won't do. But they've offered a solution." Her smile turned predatory, revealing teeth that seemed too sharp in the dim light. "Drop the charges, return to Marcus voluntarily, and they'll overlook this unfortunate misunderstanding. Refuse, and well, Accidents happened to runaway Omegas all the time in the city. The threat hung in the air like poison, but underneath Seraphina's fear was something else. A strange sense of déjà vu, as if she'd heard these exact words before in circumstances she couldn't quite remember. But as Vivian spoke, something strange began happening to Seraphina. The room seemed to shimmer around the edges, and for a moment she could have sworn she saw her stepmother's face overlaid with others, different features, but the same cruel smile, the same predatory gleam in eyes that weren't quite the right color. The sensation was disorienting, like looking through multiple photographs layered on top of each other. "I know you," she whispered, the words falling from her lips without conscious thought. "I've seen you before." Vivian's expression flickered with something that might have been surprise before settling back into its mask of cruel satisfaction. Seraphina's blood turned to ice, but not just from the immediate threat. Something was happening to her. Memories that weren't quite memories were surfacing, images of running through forests under different moons, of faces she knew but had never met, of dying in ways that made no sense. "He tried to kill me," she whispered, but even as she said it, she knew it didn't matter. This conversation had happened before. Omega lives were expendable. Alpha reputations were not. Cain cracked his knuckles meaningfully, and she realized with crystal clarity that she had two choices: go back to Marcus and die slowly, or refuse and die quickly. But underneath that realization was another, more terrifying one. She had made this choice before. Many times before. The world around her began to shift and blur, and suddenly Seraphina was somewhere else entirely. She stood in a moonlit clearing, wearing a white dress that was definitely not from this century, facing a woman whose face was familiar but wrong, Vivian's features, but with dark hair and different clothes. "Please," a voice that was hers, but not hers, begged. "I never did anything to hurt you." The woman laughed, raising hands that crackled with dark magic. "Your very existence hurts me, child. As long as the Luna Primaris bloodline lives, my power remains incomplete." The scene shifted like smoke, and she was running through a Victorian London street, her elaborate bustle skirts hampering her escape as pursuers closed in. Then she was in what looked like medieval times, pressed against cold stone walls while torches flickered ominously nearby. Each scene was different, but somehow the same. She was always running, always hunted, always dying before she could reach her full power. And in each lifetime, there was always a man with golden eyes searching for her, arriving just moments too late to save her. The visions came faster now, flashing through her consciousness like a fevered dream. Different eras, different clothes, different names, but always the same soul, always the same desperate love story cut short by violence and betrayal. She saw herself as Isabella in 1847, throat cut by her own cousin who'd been promised gold for the deed. As Evangeline in 1623, burned as a witch before her powers could fully manifest. As Celeste in 1344, poisoned at her own wedding feast. The common thread through all the lifetimes was the woman orchestrating her death, always wearing a different face, always using different people, but always with the same dark magic crackling around her fingers. Sometimes she was a noblewoman, sometimes a merchant's wife, sometimes a traveling healer, but always she was there in the shadows, pulling strings and ensuring that the Luna Primaris died before she could fulfill her destiny. And always, always, there was a man with golden eyes who loved her desperately across every incarnation, searching through lifetimes to find her again and again, only to lose her to the same curse over and over. The vision snapped back to the present with jarring suddenness, leaving Seraphina gasping and disoriented in her tiny apartment. But now she understood with terrifying clarity what was happening. This was the 8th time she'd lived this life, the 8th time she'd awakened to her power, the 8th time she'd faced this choice. And 7 times before, she'd chosen wrong. 7 times, she'd been manipulated into situations where she died before she could grow strong enough to break the curse that bound her. The woman wearing Vivian's face was just the latest mask worn by her eternal enemy, the witch who'd cursed her bloodline centuries ago and had been orchestrating her death through every incarnation. You, Seraphina breathed, looking at Vivian with new understanding. It's been you all along. Different faces, different names, but always you. For just a moment, Vivian's careful mask slipped, revealing something ancient and malevolent underneath. Then she laughed, but it sounded forced now, uncertain. I don't know what you're talking about, dear. You're clearly having some sort of breakdown. But Cain shifted nervously, and Seraphina realized that even he could sense the change in the air, the way power was beginning to gather around her like a storm waiting to break. The memories were coming clearer now, and with them came knowledge that had been locked away for lifetimes. The witch's name was Helena Mulgrave now, though she'd worn dozens of identities over the centuries. She was the one who'd cursed the Luna Primaris bloodline in the first place, jealous of their connection to the moon goddess and hungry for their power. The curse was elegant in its cruelty. Seraphina would be reborn again and again, but never with the memories that would let her avoid the same traps. She would awaken to her power, find love, and then die before she could grow strong enough to break free. Each death fed Helena's magic, making her stronger while keeping the Luna Primaris weak and fragmented. But something was different this time. The curse was weakening. She could feel it in the way the memories were surfacing, in the way her power hummed stronger beneath her skin. 7 lifetimes of accumulated love and loss and determination were bleeding through, giving her strength she'd never had before. This was why Lysandra had arranged everything so carefully, why the trauma had to be so precise. She'd been trying to trigger exactly this awakening, this breaking through of old memories that would finally give Seraphina the knowledge she needed to fight back. The sound of splintering would make them all freeze, but Seraphina barely registered it. She was too busy processing the flood of memories and emotions from 7 previous lives, 7 previous loves, 7 previous heartbreaks. Damon filled the doorway like an avenging angel, his presence making the cramped apartment feel even smaller. He'd clearly run here, his hair was disheveled and his breathing harsh. But his eyes burned with protective fury that made Cain step backward despite himself, and Seraphina felt her heart break all over again because she could see in his expression that he was remembering too. Not everything, maybe, but enough to understand that they'd been here before. Threatening my maid in her own home, Damon said conversationally, but his voice carried undertones that spoke of barely leashed violence. That's a capital offense in my territory. But even as he spoke, Seraphina could see the confusion in his eyes, the way he kept looking at her like he was seeing ghosts. The mate bond carried echoes across lifetimes, fragments of memory that manifested as dreams and inexplicable feelings of recognition. He'd been searching for her for centuries, drawn by instincts he couldn't fully understand, following clues that led him to the right place at almost the right time. Almost, but never quite enough to save her. Your Majesty, Vivian stammered, finally recognizing who she was dealing with, but Seraphina could see the calculations happening behind her eyes. Helena had planned for this contingency too, had probably been manipulating events to ensure Damon would arrive at exactly this moment, when Seraphina would be most vulnerable and least likely to trust him. We didn't know you knew exactly what you were doing, Damon cut her off, his voice dropping to alpha command frequency that made both step-family members bare their throats in instinctive submission. But the display of dominance felt hollow to Seraphina now, knowing how many times they'd played out variations of this same scene. As the confrontation played out in front of her, Seraphina found herself remembering other versions of this moment. Sometimes Damon arrived in time to drive off the immediate threat, only for Helena to strike from a different angle. Sometimes he was delayed by carefully orchestrated emergencies, arriving to find only her cooling corpse. Sometimes Helena didn't bother with intermediaries at all, simply appearing in her true form to finish what she'd started centuries ago. But this time felt different. This time, Seraphina remembered, and that changed everything. Get out, she said quietly, and though her voice was soft, it carried a power that made the windows rattle in their frames. Silver light began to pulse beneath her skin, but it was different now, not the wild, untrained energy of her first awakening, but something controlled and deliberate, enhanced by the accumulated strength of 7 previous incarnations. Both of you. Now. Kane took one look at the growing aura around her and bolted for the door, his survival instincts finally overriding whatever hold Helena had over him. But Vivian lingered, her mask slipping further to reveal the ancient malevolence underneath. "You think remembering changes anything?" she asked, and now her voice carried the weight of centuries, the carefully cultivated accent falling away to reveal something older and infinitely more dangerous. "You think this time will be different? I've been planning this moment for lifetimes, child. Every variable accounted for, every contingency prepared for. You will die tonight, just like all the times before, and I will finally claim the power that should have been mine from the beginning." The air around her shimmered with dark magic, and Seraphina realized that the final confrontation was beginning whether she was ready or not. But as Helena's power gathered, Seraphina felt something she'd never experienced in any of her previous lives. Calm certainty. She remembered dying 7 times, remembered the fear and confusion and helplessness that had consumed her final moments. But she also remembered loving and being loved, remembered moments of joy and connection that had made even cursed lives worth living. And most importantly, she remembered learning. Each lifetime had taught her something new about her power, about Helena's weaknesses, about the ways love could transcend even death itself. "And now you're going to leave," Damon continued, unaware of the magical standoff developing behind him. "If I ever see you near Seraphina again, I'll consider it an act of war against my pack." But even as he spoke, Seraphina could feel Helena's power building, could sense the trap closing around them. This was the moment, the choice that would determine whether the cycle continued or finally broke. She could let Damon protect her, could hide behind his strength the way she had in previous lives, and watch helplessly as Helena found another way to destroy them both. Or she could step forward and fight with the accumulated knowledge and power of 8 lifetimes, trusting that this time, finally, she was strong enough to win. As Vivian Helena smiled with cold anticipation and began to weave the spell that had killed Seraphina 7 times before, Seraphina made her choice. The silver light exploded outward from her skin, but this time it carried with it the echo of every previous awakening, every moment of power she'd touched across the centuries. This time, she wasn't just the Luna Primaris awakening to her heritage. She was a warrior who'd been fighting this battle across multiple lifetimes, and she was done running. The curse was about to meet its match, and Helena Morgrave was about to discover that some bonds, especially those forged in love and tempered by repeated loss, were stronger than any magic she could weave. "Because you're worth protecting," Damon said simply, and the certainty in his voice made her broken wolf finally sing. Not with weakness or fear, but with recognition. This was her mate, not perfect, not uncomplicated, but real and strong and willing to fight the world for her. When she stepped into his arms, it felt like coming home after a lifetime of wandering in the dark. "I was so scared," she whispered against his chest, breathing in his scent like a lifeline. "Not of you, but of not being enough. Of being the weak link that brings down the most powerful alpha in the territories." Damon's arms tightened around her, and she felt him press a kiss to the top of her head. "You're not weak," he murmured. "You survived an abusive mate, escaped your toxic family, and built a life on your own. You're the strongest person I know." The mate bond snapped into place like a rubber band finally finding its tension point. Seraphina gasped as warmth flooded her system, and for the first time in months, her wolf was fully present, not broken or silent, but quiet by choice. She'd never been damaged. She'd been waiting for the right alpha to call her home. "I can feel you," she breathed in wonder, and Damon's eyes flashed gold with answering recognition. "Marcus won't be a problem anymore," Damon told her as they stood wrapped in each other's arms, watching the sunset paint her apartment in shades of amber and rose. "The Blackthorn Pack has agreed to exile him rather than face my displeasure. You're safe now. We're safe now." His voice held such certainty that she believed him completely. For the first time in her life, someone powerful was using their strength to protect rather than hurt her. But in the deepening shadows outside her window, Another figure watched their reunion with eyes like ice. Councilwoman Helena Morgrave had ruled the supernatural courts for 3 centuries, and she had no intention of allowing an unknown Omega to disrupt the careful political balance she'd spent decades building. The Alpha King needed a strong mate, preferably one of Helena's carefully chosen candidates. This little nobody would have to go. As she turned away from the window, Helena's lips curved in a smile that promised Seraphina's fairy tale was far from over. After all, even kings could be controlled if you knew which puppet strings to pull. And Helena Morgrave knew them all.